It was the crown jewel in the world's largest empire, a land of 1,000 languages and millions of souls, home to ancient faiths, empires and civilizations. But in the 18th century, a new power arrived, not as a kingdom, but as a corporation. What followed was conquest by profit, subjugation by bureaucracy, and, well, a transformation so complete even memory bent to the will of empire. Was this the civilizing mission it claimed to be, or one of history's grandest extractive operations? Welcome to the Library of Lost Lands, where we explore the rise and fall of nations that once stood proud on the map, now consigned to memory. These aren't just footnotes, they're warnings, lessons and echoes of peoples whose sovereignty was taken, bartered or betrayed. At its height, British India was not just India. The British Raj, officially known as the Indian Empire, was the crown-administered colonial regime that ruled over the Indian subcontinent from 1858 to 1947, following the dissolution of the East India Company after the 1857 rebellion. At its height, the Raj governed not only modern-day India, but also Pakistan, Bangladesh, Burma, and administered other outposts like Aden and the Straits settlements. The flag of the British Raj was the Union, jack-defaced with the Star of India emblem. The civil ensign used for official purposes in India was a red field, British red ensign with the Star of India in the fly, symbolizing British sovereignty and imperial order. The star itself was a white five-pointed star surrounded by a laurel wreath and surmounted by the imperial crown. By the late 19th century, British India held over 400 million people, more than a quarter of the world's population. It contributed legions to imperial wars and offered vast markets for British industrial goods. Spanning mountains, deserts and monsoons, it was not a nation but a continent of cultures, ruled from afar. British India began not with a king but with a company. The East India Company, founded in 1600, was a private enterprise backed by royal charter. Over time, it amassed its own army, navy and tax systems, eventually becoming larger than the British military itself. Its shareholders were London elites, its battlegrounds were Mughal palaces and Indian villages. Through bribery, manipulation and force, the company inserted itself into Indian politics. The turning point came in 1757 at Plassey, where it defeated the Nawab of Bengal using Indian sepoys and, frankly, some rather shady alliances. From there, it swallowed whole provinces, manipulating fractured princely states into dependencies. By 1858, after the trauma of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, control passed from company to crown. Queen Victoria became Empress of India. The Raj had begun. There were changes worth noting. The British outlawed sati, the ritual burning of widows, and suppressed thugi, gangs who strangled travellers in the name of Kali. They standardized weights and measures, introduced English education, and built universities that would later produce India's nationalists. Indian soldiers, sepoys, fought in both world wars, from Gallipoli to Burma. Indian revenue funded British campaigns in Africa and China. The empire relied on Indian manpower, both on the battlefield and in bureaucratic service. But even these positives were filtered through imperial interests, not altruism. Despite its grandeur, the Raj was deeply flawed. It operated through a rigid racial hierarchy. British officials held all top posts. Indians were barred from meaningful governance. The Indian civil service was touted as meritocratic, but exams were held in London and heavily biased. Nowhere is the hypocrisy of the British claim more evident than in the economy. Before British colonization, India was one of the world's great economic powerhouses. In 1700, the Indian subcontinent accounted for nearly 24% of the world's GDP, making it comparable to China and far ahead of any European nation. India's economic strength lay in its rich and diverse manufacturing sectors, especially textiles, steel, shipbuilding, and high-quality artisanal goods. Indian textiles, in particular, were prized around the world for their fine quality and vibrant dyes. Cities like Dhaka, Surat, and Murshidabad were global centers of production and trade. British rule systematically dismantled this prosperity. The East India Company and later the British Crown imposed punitive tariffs on Indian textiles up to 70%, while allowing British textiles to be imported duty-free into India. Indian weavers and artisans were unable to compete, and in some cases were deliberately suppressed through violence or forced deindustrialization. Indian looms fell silent, while the mills of Manchester thrived. Meanwhile, the British implemented a harsh taxation regime on Indian peasants and artisans to fund their wars and fuel London's coffers. Profits from Indian raw materials like cotton, indigo and opium were shipped to Britain, where they were processed and resold, creating value abroad, but poverty at home. Far from being a civilizing mission, British rule was a textbook case of extractive colonialism, a siphoning of India's wealth to support the imperial machine. Railways, built to move cotton, coal and tea, not people. Tracks connected resource zones to ports, not villages to cities. Funded by Indian taxes, they provided guaranteed profits to British firms. Indian engineers, frozen out. Local steel mills and locomotive factories were stifled. The British enforced laws prohibiting Indian textile exports while flooding the subcontinent with machine-made Manchester cloth. India's once thriving weavers were left destitute. Famines, often seen as natural disasters, were worsened, sometimes caused by imperial policy. During the 1943 Bengal famine, 3 million died, while Churchill's cabinet prioritized food for Europe. Rice exports continued as Indians starved. When told of the deaths, Churchill reportedly said Indians should breed less. India went from 20% of global GDP in 1700 to 3% by 1947. It was not developed, it was exploited. The winds of change came with World War II. With over 2.5 million Indian soldiers serving in War II, the Indian Army became the largest volunteer army in history. In addition to these soldiers, billions and billions of pounds were borrowed by the British from India to be used on war expenses. India's forced participation and the catastrophic Bengal famine eroded public trust. Gandhi's Quit India movement, Subhas Chandra Bose's militant campaign, and widespread unrest left Britain weakened. On August 15, 1947, India gained independence, but not without pain. The subcontinent was split along religious lines into India and Pakistan, triggering one of the largest and bloodiest mass migrations in history. Millions fled across borders. Hundreds of thousands were killed. The empire's jewel broke, but not cleanly. India emerged independent, wounded, but resilient. Burma, now Myanmar, once part of British India, went its separate way in 1948. Aden and the Strait settlements too eventually gained independence. The legacy of partition haunts the region. Tensions in Kashmir, cycles of Indo-Pak wars and border disputes remain, but in India itself democracy took root. A republic was born, flawed, chaotic but enduring. Yet amidst the chaos something remarkable happened. Famines, once a recurring nightmare under colonial rule, virtually disappeared. As Nobel laureate Amartya Sen has shown, no large-scale famine has occurred in independent India. The key difference? Democracy. With a free press, elected accountability and public debate, the Indian government could no longer ignore the suffering of its citizens. Unlike colonial administrators, it had to answer to the people. India became a republic in 1950, choosing democracy over dynasty, planning over plunder. The economy slowly rebuilt. Industries rose where once only raw materials left, and a new generation of Indians began to write their own story. The echoes of the Raj remain. Railway stations, English courts, hill stations like Shimla, and even the parliamentary system are relics of British rule. The English language and the most quintessential of quaint upper-class British sports, cricket, has been claimed by Indians to be an Indian game, accidentally invented by the English. The Indian Army, once a colonial force, is now one of the largest in the world, and so too is the memory, complicated, bitter, sometimes nostalgic. The empire is gone, but its shadow still walks the land. British India was never just a colony, it was a canvas on which Britain painted its vision of modernity. But behind the grandeur lay extraction, exploitation and inequality. Today, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh exist as independent nations, but the scars of the Raj remain. What does it mean to inherit a land where sovereignty was once sold to shareholders? And when the maps were redrawn, who got to hold the pen? Hold the